Yeah, you effin' with some wet-ass P-word. Bring a bucket and a mop for this wet-ass P-word. Give me everything you've got for this wet-ass.
I'm Glenda Lewis. Governor Whitmer has announced a new plan to send $10 million in state general funds to help people in Wayne and Washtenaw counties recovering from last month's devastating flooding. The extra funds will go to families who are not eligible for federal assistance or who aren't getting adequate resources from FEMA. And that's an issue we're hearing more about. Dozens of people with sewage backups and flooding damage are being turned down for FEMA assistance. President Biden declared Wayne and Washtenaw counties disaster areas, clearing the way for federal assistance. So we're going to bring in our Jim Kurtzner talking with flood victims and FEMA live on Detroit's East Side with this important update. Jim, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Glenda. Good afternoon, Glenda. FEMA wanted us to do this story as they continue to take applications throughout both counties, Wayne and Washtenaw, and clear up some confusion. FEMA is designed to help people who don't have enough insurance coverage to cover all of their losses. We did our first story earlier this week with a homeowner who got some insurance coverage but didn't cover much of her damage, in fact, only a fraction. She applied for FEMA help, she was denied, and she was told why.
They don't cover drywall, flooring, nothing if nobody lives in the basement. It's considered completely non-essential.
Is she wrong?
Right. No, she's correct.
That means people who had personal property stored in a basement, lost it all in the water, will not get that covered by FEMA. That means people who lost carpeting, tile floors, walls in all the water will not get that covered by FEMA. FEMA will cover tear-out, cleanup, and sanitization costs, not covered by insurance. FEMA will cover the cost of hot water tanks, washers and dryers, a furnace. But get this, don't expect to be made completely whole.
The assistance that FEMA provides is not meant to make a home the way it was pre-disaster.
Take a look. FEMA has people going door to door taking applications for assistance. This is in Dearborn Heights, but word is spreading by the dozens how people are being turned down.
6 posts on Nextdoor a day about people being denied.
We found Clarence Smith has his own water damage from sewer backups in his home and rental properties he owns.
Government has to help the citizens. Simple as that. City, state, federal government.
Down the street from him is Diane Cottle, who's lived here 50 years. FEMA told us personal belongings restoration costs can be covered with SBA low-interest loans.
We need relief from the government. We need it to be released so that we could get something done without it being a loan for a disaster.
A lot of people are going to be discouraged.
Well, again, FEMA's not an insurance program. It's federal grant assistance to help families make their homes habitable again. One doesn't need to have nice floor covering in order to have a habitable home.
Natural disasters are a growing threat to billions of people throughout the world. Between the storm largely affecting Texas earlier this year and Hurricane Ida that recently ripped through the Caribbean, parts of South America, and half the United States, these severe weather storms in 2021 alone caused $70 billion worth in damages. I say this because here in this hellhole country, putting a dollar amount on total losses tends to get people's attention. Unfortunately, it's been proven time and time again in this country that property is routinely valued over people. But what happens when people who have so little to begin with end up losing it all from a natural disaster because the powers that be that are instrumental in doling out the finite amount of relief deem your home not worth saving? Or how the legacy of discriminatory housing policies is a precursor for today's institutional racism? Let's get into the details with our first story. Category 4 storm Hurricane Ida has finally fucked off, but coming in right behind her is Hurricane Nicholas. a Category 1 storm that's largely affecting parts of Texas and Louisiana that were still recovering from his predecessor. I don't know why I'm personifying these hurricanes. Sorry, they're not people, just huge, cataclysmic assholes. Anyway, Ida touched down in Louisiana on the 16th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, wreaking havoc in some areas that still hadn't recovered from the 2005 natural disaster. We'll get into that in a little bit more detail later. 109 deaths have been confirmed so far in relation to Ida, including 91 in the US and 20 in Venezuela. I think at this point we all know how destructive natural disasters are, but a 2017 Global Citizens report found that they cause 14 million people to experience homelessness each year. See, that's the thing about natural disasters, especially these assholes. They destroy communities indiscriminately, but when it comes to the distribution of resources and aid to clean up the mess left behind, not so equitable. The New York Times recently highlighted a growing body of research showing that FEMA, the government agency responsible for helping Americans recover from disasters, often help white disaster victims more than people of color, even when the amount of damage is the same. Not only do individual white Americans often receive more aid from FEMA, so do the communities in which they live, according to several recent studies based on federal data. This article also points out that more money to rebuild communities after a disaster may increase property values, pricing out lower-income renters. And individual disaster assistance tends to benefit homeowners more than renters, and people of color are more likely to rent. The article references several key findings, all of which point to racial inequities. What struck me as almost a concession was the notion that maybe FEMA doesn't mean to be so institutionally racist. I mean, can they really help it that there's a long-standing disparity in home ownership along racial lines, meaning that white people get assistance because they're homeowners compared to non-white, particularly black renters? I'm sure it's not a coincidence that a growing body of research is finding just how racist FEMA really is, but on September 3rd, they did announce that they were making changes to individual assistance policies to advance equity for disaster survivors. These changes include expanding forms of documentation to prove ownership for homeowners and renters, providing expanded housing assistance and other needs assistance funding, and expanding financial assistance for disaster-caused disability. A good first step to improve the agency's response to disasters going forward, of course, but what about the damage that's already been done that isn't addressed through new and improved retroactive standards? Let's get into the data to see how far these disparities go by observing the damage left behind by one disaster in particular, Hurricane Katrina. The National Coalition for the Homeless published a report in 2009 about the relationship between natural disasters and homelessness, stating that natural disasters can hit at any time and anywhere. It is not uncommon that such disasters have left thousands of people experiencing homelessness. People left homeless by natural disasters have fewer resources than any other type of homeless person. There is no park to camp out in, no alley to sleep in, and no bridge to sleep under. One of the most telling examples of this relationship is the case of Hurricane Katrina in 2005. More than 1.5 million people were directly affected, and more than 800,000 citizens were forced to live outside their homes, the largest displacement of people since the Great Dust Bowl migrations of the 1930s. 12,000 people were left homeless in New Orleans after Katrina. In most cities, homeless people account for about 1% of the population, but in New Orleans, 4% of the population was still experiencing homelessness as of 2009. After natural disasters, there is generally an increase in homelessness which ends in about 6 months. In New Orleans, the rate of homelessness in and around the city has continued to increase. Many victims of natural disasters suffer from PTSD, anxiety, and depression, while those who previously had control over mental illness often struggle to find the treatment necessary to maintain that control. The prevalence of serious mental illness increased from 11% to 14% after Hurricane Katrina. Out of the entire homeless population in New Orleans, 60% said they were left homeless after Katrina. And of that 60%, only 30% said they had received any assistance from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, known as FEMA. It's important to remember that Hurricane Katrina had such a large impact on the entire city of New Orleans because of crumbling infrastructure, specifically the levees that were in a state of disrepair. And because the levees weren't able to hold the amount of water that came from Hurricane Katrina, 80% of the entire city was submerged underwater. This led to 200,000 residences completely destroyed. And of that 200,000, 41,000 were rental units for low-income residents. When these rental units were restored, the average price of rent nearly doubled from $461 per month to $836 per month. The total incurred losses from Hurricane Katrina amounted to $81 billion. That is 9 times the 2005 FEMA budget of $9.4 billion. There is clearly an inadequate pool of money to go around for all survivors of natural disasters, and even with FEMA's new standards, there's still too wide of a discrepancy between catastrophic damage and federal relief to make a surmountable difference, especially if the majority of assistance is going to homeowners by default. An NPR report shows that FEMA analyzed 4.8 million aid registrations submitted by disaster survivors between 2014 and 2018. In this report, FEMA compared applicants' income. The poorest renters were 23% less likely than higher income renters to get housing help. The poorest homeowners received half as much to rebuild their homes compared with higher income homeowners, disparities that researchers say cannot be explained by relative repair costs. FEMA was also twice as likely to deny housing assistance to lower-income disaster survivors because the agency judged the damage to their homes to be insufficient. This discrepancy inevitably displaces a disproportionate amount of low-income and non-white renters when their quarters are destroyed beyond repair. Not to mention, a 2013 study found that 2/3 of renters couldn't afford rental insurance, and cost burdens for low-wage tenants have only become worse since then. It's not like FEMA doesn't know about the growing threat of climate change-related disasters. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has been collecting information, including the financial cost of destruction, since the 1980s, which again is unfortunately the widely accepted system of measurement for scaling the devastation of natural disasters, not the impact that it has on human lives, per se. Even though the cost of destruction dramatically supersedes its FEMA budget year over year, the government does a Pikachu shocked face every time these disasters become more powerful. These shortcomings often leave affected residents to their own devices. Our final segment will highlight one organization's best practice for community-led action to manage the growing threat of climate change at a neighborhood level. In our final section, I wanted to feature one coalition in particular that really understands the necessity of community-led rebuilding, and that's Mutual Aid Disaster Relief. It's a grassroots disaster relief network based on the principles of solidarity, mutual aid, and autonomous direct action. If you're not familiar with mutual aid, totally understandable, but to give a brief description, in organization theory, mutual aid is a voluntary reciprocal exchange of resources and services for mutual benefit. Mutual aid projects are a form of political participation in which people take responsibility for caring for one another and changing political conditions. I'm pulling this information directly from their website, either from their mission statement or frequently asked questions, so let's go. Mutual Aid Disaster Relief responds to disasters, educates about community organizing as disaster preparedness and collaborative neighborhood crisis response, and collects and disseminates lessons learned in the field. Mutual Aid Disaster Relief includes activists who have been involved in a variety of disaster responses, have experience doing educational work and network building, and having continued to support their own community's mutual aid-based projects and justice work. Here are some of their best practices from their point of view. By working with, listening to, and supporting impacted communities, especially their most vulnerable members, to lead their own recovery, we strive to build long-term, sustainable, and resilient communities. We are witnessing and adding to a movement of responders who provide an alternative to the government and nonprofit industrial complex's hierarchical, charity-based model of response, which preserves the status quo and profits off of the disasters it creates. Instead, mutual aid disaster relief is solidarity-based, relationship-based, participatory, and rooted in the understanding of disaster relief work as justice work, whose larger aim is survival, self-determination, and collective liberation. Mutual aid disaster relief is a decentralized network defined by the character and creativity of a multitude of communities drawn together by our collective commitment to stand in solidarity with those impacted by disasters and turn the tide in favor of climate justice. It is a moving, growing, contracting dynamic of like-minded yet diverse people. Its network is not so much a standing army of volunteers as an interlocking web of individuals, affinities, and relationships, some already acting, many more holding the potential energy to act when a disaster strikes. Mutual aid disaster relief is just one tiny little branch of this swiftly growing superorganism, and is comprised of people committed to supporting the growth of the greater autonomous mutual aid-based disaster response movement by seeking to encourage more connections, inspire newcomers, and facilitate learning of important skills and tactics, all while contributing to disaster survivors' well-being and self-determination. To learn more about this amazing organization, check out the website at mutualaiddisasterrelief.org. I know that this is the worst time for a natural disaster to strike in the middle of a pandemic and an economic recession, and so many people are spread incredibly thin. But mutual aid is a great way of building coalitions and networks of individuals on the ground that will withstand the test of time better than any policy, any pot of money, any top-down decision. Mutual aid also strengthens the values and the core of a community. It allows for self-determination, and it is a wonderful sense of camaraderie when so many people band together to help the most impacted, the most vulnerable. And there's never an overabundance of time or resources for mutual aid groups. In fact, it's the opposite. The more that we can do to help one another out, the better. That being said, thank you so much for watching this episode of Housing News. I hope you liked it, and if you didn't, my apologies. We'll try again next week.